the experience of countries like Sweden showed that we did not need to have top-down, centralized quarantine and repression of the population and lockdown. That was a huge mistake. It led to much greater mortality and misery than would otherwise have been the case. We won't be as much better off in 2050 as we could be if we adopted more sensible policies. It's the opportunity cost that's beginning to bother me. As for climate change, I've been covering this topic for 40 years, and I've gradually come to the view that it's real, that it's a problem, but it's not a very major one. I don't get very worried about artificial intelligence. The way we teach science is often wrong. This has been a spectacular decade for Africa.
You just messed up my whole worldview just now. Just Welcome to the Megatweight Show. Today, we're joined by Matt Ridley, a New York Times bestselling author whose work invites us to question our assumptions about humanity, science, and the future. His book, The Rational Optimist, challenged how we think about progress, innovation, and resilience. Matt has explored topics from genetics to pandemics, shedding light on the stories and principles that drive human advancement. Today, we'll dive into his fascinating ideas and discover how his unique perspective can help us reshape our understanding of what lies ahead. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Margaret, it's a joy to be with you, and congratulations on your recent prize. That was what caused me to get in touch with you.
Truly appreciate your support. Thank you, Matt. So, Matt, let's start with curiosity. You have covered such a vast array of topics throughout your career. I'm tempted to ask you, what has led you to explore areas like genetics, innovation, and scientific discovery? And also, what does keep you curious?
Yeah, well, I began as an evolutionary biologist. I then became a journalist writing about everything from science and technology to eventually economics and politics as well. I became more and more intrigued by the way the human world works, as it were, and trying to bring the perspective of evolution to it. And at the same time, I was very excited about being on the planet at the same time that the human being became the first species to read its own genetic recipe. And I thought that was a really exciting moment. So I wanted a ringside seat at the beginning of the genomics revolution. And that got me more and more interested in genomics, which I think is one of the great enlightenments of our time. And I feel that these themes come together really when you talk about innovation, because evolution is a form of innovation. It's a form of genetic innovation that happens through sort of trial and error, through natural selection and evolution. Human innovation in technology is also a form of trial and error and selection. And so the parallels between those two worlds have fascinated me ever since.
Interesting. So, Matt, for those who are new to The Rational Optimist, could you please share the core message of the book, and why is it that you believe optimism about the future is well-founded?
Well, I set out to write a book about progress, what it is and why it happens to human beings and not to rabbits or to rocks. What is it about us that enables us to achieve different living standards at different times? And I knew I was going to be fairly optimistic because I was very angry, actually, with the people who had persuaded me to be pessimistic about human future in my youth. The people who said that the population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, pollution was going to shorten human lifespan, the deserts were expanding, the ice age was returning, the sperm counts were falling, and on the 31st of December 1999, civilization would end because the computers couldn't cope with a change of date. That sort of thing. And when it dawned on me that actually the world was getting better, not worse, for most people most of the time, I thought it was worth cataloguing that fact and telling a younger audience that. But what amazed me when I came to write the book was how many more things were getting better than I thought. I thought some things would be getting worse. On the whole, very few things are getting worse. Traffic congestion, obesity, yes, but the big things, child mortality, down by an incredible 2/3 globally in my lifetime. Lifespan increasing at the rate of 5 hours per day in my lifetime, globally. Um, the number of people in extreme poverty going down faster than in any other lifetime that's ever been lived, actually. So I wanted to draw attention to these facts, but I also wanted to try and understand why they happened, why the good things were outnumbering the bad. And for me, that came down to an understanding of what it is that makes society tick. What is the process by which we live our lives in social exchange with each other? And it seems to me that we've invented a system of working for each other through exchange and specialization. I do what I'm good at, you do what you're good at, and I swap the results of my work with the results of your work. And we actually raise both our living standards if the system works properly. And we're doing that on an enormous scale. So I'm consuming infinitesimally small percentages of the work of millions and millions of other people who are all working for me as if they were my servants. Um, and yet they're not doing so because they want to benefit me. They want to make a living, and I'm the same to them. And when you play out that process, you realize it's much more likely to produce good outcomes than bad. Because if you want to use that system to destroy other people, um, you're going to run into the problem that they don't want to be destroyed, and they're going to find ways to stop you. And so, actually, the peaceful exchange of ideas, an exchange of labor, an exchange of innovations and technology is a necessarily a benign process on net. Now, that doesn't mean bad things can't happen. Of course, they
Right,
can, and bad
right.
things do happen. And there's a lot of zero sum thinking in the human spirit as well. But that's my main feeling. That's why I felt in that book I had to go right back in history to the beginning, to the Stone Age, to understand where the habit of human exchange came from, but also to look forward to the future.
And I love that book because it's still happening. Young people are still being fed doom and gloom stories. We have no idea of how
Exactly.
far we have come as a species. So that book is usually a go-to for me that I recommend to people when they want to argue about how far we've come. Um,
Yeah, but can I add a
sure,
sort of tiny note of pessimism to my
sure. Oh,
optimism?
mad pessimism, really? Go there, go for it.
Well, I'm toying with the idea of writing another book now, which I don't think it'll be called the Rational Pessimist, but it will say that there is still a continuing improvement in human living standards, thanks to innovation, that will continue throughout this century. I'm very confident of that. Absent an asteroid impact or a nuclear war or a mega pandemic, we will be better off in 2050. 95% of us will than we are today, etc. But we won't be as much better off in 2050 as we could be if we adopted more sensible policies. It's the opportunity cost that's beginning to bother me. The difference between what we could achieve in 2050 and what we probably will achieve is, I think, enormous. And there's so many people who are against innovation, against free enterprise, against exchange and specialization for various wrong reasons that I think that, that it's important now to draw attention to the likely failure to realize as much improvement as we can,
Oh,
as we
you're
could.
singing. Yes, you are definitely. These are your words are songs to me. Sad, sad songs, but songs to me because I think nowhere better than the African continent can we see how bad policies keep people behind and slow radically the potential of going from point A to point B that we're still there, but the world doesn't understand the relationship between the state of poverty in Africa and bad policies, overregulation. But the minute we do, hopefully things will change.
Yeah, and
Um,
can I say one thing
sure,
about Africa? Sorry, I don't mean to hijack
sure.
your
Go ahead. No, this is
conversation,
great. Please
but
go ahead.
I'll ask you one thing about Africa. Um,
Mhm.
when I wrote The Rational Optimist, there were still people around saying, whatever goes on in Europe and Asia and North America, Africa cannot possibly share in this prosperity.
I know.
It's just not possible. There's too many people, there's too much poverty, there's, the resources problems are too great, etc. So, quite often in my book, I said, look, even in Africa, actually, things are moving in the right direction.
Mhm.
Um, and that wasn't a very fashionable thing to say. But over the last 15 years since the book came out, I think it's very striking that there's a lot more reason to be pessimistic about Europe and well, Europe in particular, but North America as well, and to some extent Asia, than there is
Mhm.
about Africa. So when people say you can't still be an optimist, look at what's happening in Ukraine, look at what's happening in the Middle East, look at what's happening with Ebola, look at what's happening with COVID. You know, they've all got all these reasons why it's crazy to be an optimist in this horrible world.
Mhm.
And I often reply to them, or I have done over the last 15 years, yes, but look at Africa. This has been a spectacular decade for Africa. It's got a long way to go, but there's a lot more peace, a lot less disease, and a lot more prosperity than there was in 2010 in Africa. And some countries have been growing incredibly fast, and they've been experiencing um, the sort of economic miracles that happened in Asia a generation earlier. So, and that's happening to people who are often very poor, and so it's even better for that reason.
Yeah.
So, am I right in using that response, Magat, or am I being naive?
No, you're not being naive. I think you're just doing exactly what you've always done, which is we have to always appreciate how far we've come. And it is true, we've come a long way, even in Africa. But from where I stand and looking at the realities on the ground, we are still the poorest region in the world. They are still, so all of it just to say, yes, we have made progress, but the amount of progress we have made, A, is very small compared to what could have been done.
Yes,
And especially if we do not change our ways, and in this case, I'm speaking specifically about policy and regulations, if we do not become more serious about it soon enough, then I'm just afraid that not only we're just going to keep doing little incremental, progress in a world that's just doing still this. And so, yes, we have come a long way along with everybody else, but not as far as we should have, could have, and most importantly, nothing right now is telling me that we will leapfrog if we don't fix our policy and regulation issues. So you are right. You are right, and we should, yeah. So that would be my reply to that. So Matt, talking about progress and innovation, I know that in your view, innovation happens more bottom up than top down. And by the way, I agree with you. But could you explain what this means and also share some examples of how this mindset really helps shape industries as well as economies?
yes, I think this is a really important insight. Innovation. What I did for my book on innovation was I catalogued a whole series of stories about innovation from a long time ago and from very recently, and so on. And common themes emerged. And one of them was it's very bottom up, it's very emergent, it's very evolutionary, it's very serendipitous. In other words, it sets off in one direction, often has to go in another direction. It relies heavily on lots of people exchanging ideas, not on brilliant people sitting in ivory towers. And so and it's not very predictable, although in some sense it's inevitable that certain things get invented at certain times. So my favorite example to just illustrate that very clearly is that in October 1903, um, uh, um, uh, a brilliant man whose name I've suddenly forgotten. um, um, ah, anyway, sorry, I'll
It's
have
going
to
to come
come
back.
back.
It's one of those. It will be back.
it's on the tip of my tongue. But anyway, there was a brilliant guy who was the head of the Smithsonian Institution, and he got a grant from the U.S. government, $25,000, to build the first powered airplane. And because he was so clever, he didn't need to talk to anyone about how to do it. He did it in secret, in private, because he didn't want other people stealing his ideas. And then he launched the first powered airplane off the top of a boat on the Potomac River in front of a large crowd in October 1903. And of course, it crashed into the water immediately.
Mm,
It was a
mm,
disaster.
mm,
2 months later, on an island off North Carolina, two bicycle mechanics without a degree between them, called Orville and Wilbur Wright,
yeah,
succeeded
right,
where
right
he
brothers.
had failed. And what was so different about the way they had done it is they did not think they were the cleverest people in the room. They didn't think they were the cleverest people in Dayton, Ohio, even. They knew that because their sister had a degree and they didn't, interestingly. That's a little detail that I enjoy. And But what they'd done is they'd done endless experiments with gliders, with kites, with wind tunnels. They'd also done a huge amount of picking the brains of other people elsewhere in the world. And in Australia, in France, in Germany, elsewhere in America, to try and understand flight through other people's eyes. So they knew that this was a collective enterprise. It's not going to happen inside one brain, it's going to happen between brains, as it were. And they eventually felt they'd done enough experiments with gliders so they could put an engine on a plane and take off. And what that story tells me in microcosm is what I hear again and again about innovation from the rest of the world. That it isn't about having a brilliant idea and pursuing it. It's about doing a ton of experiments um, and gradually letting the truth emerge in a sort of bottom up way. And Thomas Edison said it best. He said, "I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work." And he tried 6,000 different types of plant material before he settled on the filament for his light bulb. So one of the things that tells me about innovation is that quite ordinary people can do it. It's not some special creativity juice that one or two people have got and the rest of us haven't. If you are prepared to swap ideas with other people, combine your thoughts, be prepared to change direction, be prepared to learn from trial and error, then you too can be an innovator. And I feel that the way we talk about this topic to school kids and others is too much. Um, we use words like creativity, which slightly implies that you've got to be a special person to do this. And I'm
Mm,
quite keen on saying no, ordinary people can be great innovators too.
amazing, amazing. Matt, you talk about how ideas combine and evolve like biological organisms, and I love it when you say ideas having sex. It's always fun when I hear you say that. Um, could you unpack this very fascinating concept and also explain how it applies to real world technological progress? I,
Yes. When I say ideas having sex is the key to innovation, I'm obviously making a bit of a joke, but I'm also actually being quite serious. I've studied evolution a lot of my life, and evolution happens through the combination and recombination of genetic sequences. So DNA sequences come together and are recombined, are shuffled in every generation. And that shuffling happens through the process of sex. That's essentially what sex is. It's combining genes from two different individuals in novel combinations. So there's nothing new about the genetic sequences that you inherit, but there are new things about the combinations you inherit. And so I said, maybe exchange is playing the same role in human innovation that sex is playing in genetic evolution. And I think this is really quite a useful insight because what's happening is that two people are coming together with different technologies, putting them together in a new combination, although they are existing technologies, and coming up with an innovation. So let me give you my favorite example of this. It's the story of a thing called the pill camera, which is a device that you swallow, and it records a film of your insides on the way through for use by medical doctors. I don't think it's been a terribly successful technology, but it was an ingenious one. And it came about after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. And I think that's a very nice idea of two very unlikely ideas having sex and producing a baby idea that was really rather useful.
Hmm. That is so funny, but it's a very good illustration. I did not know about that one. Matt, talking about innovation, I think the word that goes hand in hand with innovation, in my mind, is also failure. So, how important do you think failure is in the process of innovation? And also, what can we learn from the failed ideas that didn't make it but still contributed to progress?
Yes, I think this is really important that failure is a critical ingredient of innovation. And if you're afraid of failure, you won't be a good innovator.
That's
Jeff Bezos, who is, in my view, a great innovator, but not a great inventor. He didn't invent
right.
e-commerce, but he did drive down the price, drive up the reliability, and work out how to make it available to people, which for me is the definition of innovation. Not just inventing a device, but making it available, affordable, and reliable. Jeff Bezos is keen on saying that if you're not swinging and missing, you won't achieve much. I believe that's a baseball metaphor, but you may know better than me. And he, you can tell the story of Amazon as a story of disastrous failures. There's a very good book called The Everything Store, which recounts the history of the company and is fairly unsparing in its um, recounting of the number of things they got wrong again and again and again. They went into retailing toys and it was a disaster. They bought a series of dot-com businesses in the 90s, which were a flop, etc., etc. There were a whole series of mistakes that Amazon made. But in
Mm,
amongst the mistakes, there were one or two triumphantly successful decisions,
mm,
um, which were enormously more impactful than the many mistakes in the end.
mm,
Things like going into web services, obviously all the things like inventing the one-click system for how to buy things easily, etc., etc. So uh, it's a good example that to me of um, a firm that was not afraid of failure, of trying things. And I once asked Bezos, what is it that enables you to be innovative now that you're a big company? And because most big companies become very uninnovative.
very,
Um,
very.
Obviously, he's no longer involved in Amazon so much now, but when he was, and his answer was quite interesting because he said, "I want to hear from mavericks within the organization who've got weird ideas, even if they're very junior employees. And the way to do that is to make sure that no middle management committee can prevent minority ideas reaching my ears." So a sort of
Mm,
reverse veto system that even if 5 out of the 6 people on the committee think it's a terrible idea, if there's one on the committee who thinks it's worth hearing, Bezos wants to hear about it. So that's the
wow.
kind of, and now obviously that system is going to produce a lot of failures. A lot of crank ideas are going to come to the top and be tried and fail. Um, so I think obviously we can't be completely forgiving of failure. We don't want to reward people for going bankrupt,
Yeah.
but at the same time, one of the great features of the American ecosystem has been that it didn't mind if you'd tried to found companies and failed 2 or 3 times, nearly as much as the European system did, and regarded that as useful experience. So I think um, we are to we are too intolerant of failure in much of the world with respect to innovation.
Mm, mm. Very true. So now we're going to shift a little bit our gears and to your other book, Viral. I think you've been having a lot of fun with it. I also feel like you've been very upset, before you wrote it. So Viral looks into how humanity has dealt with pandemics over time. The question here would be, what do you think are the most significant lessons that you found from the COVID-19 pandemic? And how can those lessons actually help us inform
Yeah.
how we tackle, future health challenges? Because we know there's going to be more in the future.
Yes. Well, I wrote this book with Alina Chan, who's a brilliant young postdoc scientist at the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT. And we teamed up because we both thought that it was becoming clear that it was possible this pandemic began with a laboratory leak. And we thought that was a very, very important question and it needed to be properly investigated. Um, we also thought it was still possible that it had come from a natural event in a market. We didn't know which was going to be right, but we thought it was really important that in order to learn from this terrible pandemic, the world should investigate how it happened. And we were rather shocked by the reluctance of the scientific establishment, the media, and much of the intelligence community to investigate properly the origin of COVID. We think a couple of years later that it's very, very likely that it did result from an accident in a laboratory. And there's a really important lesson here, actually, because one of the first clues as to why this was potentially a laboratory leak was how incredibly well this virus was adapted to spreading between human beings from the start.
Mm,
And that doesn't necessarily indicate it came from a laboratory, but it is quite hard to explain why this was when every other natural zoonotic spillover has produced a virus that can be very virulent, very dangerous, but not very infectious, not very
mm,
easy at transmitting between people. It takes a while, it takes months or even years before a new virus gets good enough at infecting people to build up to create a big epidemic or a pandemic. So this was the case with Ebola in Africa, but with Hendra and Nipah in Asia, with Marburg, with SARS itself, the first SARS in 2003, and so on.
mm,
That they were very lethal, but they weren't very infectious. This one was not very lethal, but it was very infectious from the start. So much so that all the measures we took to try and stop it were basically a failure. The social isolation, the lockdowns, masking, even the vaccine, basically were a total failure at preventing this virus rampaging around the world whenever and wherever it wanted to. Australia and New Zealand kept it out for a while, and Taiwan and Japan did quite well for a while in suppressing it, and China too, but not forever. It soon caught up with them, and it now spreads in waves around the world whenever it feels like. Now, for me, that can be a slightly reassuring message, curiously, because it suggests that the zoonotic spillovers we worry about that happen all the time in markets and in forests in Africa and Asia and other tropical parts of the world um, are probably slow burn enough for us to defeat them in the early stages. And just a little bit of vigilance and a little bit of care, and we can actually defeat them. So something like H5N1, the avian influenza that's currently spreading in dairy cattle in America, is not yet very infectious in human beings. And as long as we can stamp out these outbreaks, it won't become so. So we need to be much more worried about the crazy experiments that were being done with viruses taken from the wild, from bats, in China, but also elsewhere in the world, to to test them on human cells and humanized mice. and to fiddle with their genes to see if you could come up with ways that were even more infectious. One of the experiments done in Wuhan, of all places, on a very similar virus to this one, increased the infectivity of the virus 10,000 fold in a humanized mouse. Now, that's a really significant and foolish thing to have been doing. So I think what we're looking at in the case of this virus is an accident, the worst accident in human history, worse than 9/11, Bhopal, and Chernobyl put together by a mile, but one that was preventable and that, if we learn the proper lessons, need never happen again.
Yeah, yeah. Needs never happen again, I guess. On that note, in your research, Matt, how do you think that pandemics have historically helped impact scientific innovation? Do you feel like there are ways in which crises can spur scientific breakthroughs?
Yes, I think it's clearly true that in responding to epidemics and pandemics, human beings have come up with useful innovations, in particular, vaccination, which is a tremendously successful technology in uh, uh, combating infectious disease. And it begins really back in the early 1700s with the inoculation of mild strains of smallpox into people to try and prevent them catching more virulent strains. And it then moves on to the use of cowpox as a way of trying to prevent people being vulnerable to smallpox. And then you get Pasteur inventing vaccines and so on. And what's so fascinating about that history is that vaccination, or inoculation as it originally was, and then vaccination, were invented and developed without any understanding of the immune system. So the science didn't have to come first, the technology came first in a way. And it is a
Interesting.
fantastic technology. I really worry that in the current situation in the 2020s, we've damaged the reputation of vaccines rather badly by over claiming for them in the case of the COVID-19 vaccines. There was a lot of people saying that this is going to prevent transmission, etc., etc. They don't have side effects. They can be used on children safely. And I think this is a big mistake, actually. I think we should have claimed much less, and then we would have done much less damage. As it is, we're going to see more measles outbreaks and other things. We're going to fail to get rid of polio, which we were on the brink of doing, because we've damaged the reputation of the vaccine technology. The other technology that I think comes from diseases very successfully is sanitation. And
Mm,
if you look at the unbelievable impact of clean water supplies, um, uh, of basically, you know, taking water and chlorinating it. It's a very simple technology, but it's made an enormous difference, particularly to typhoid and cholera and things like that, but to many other diseases too. So, that's an example for me of really quite a low tech, simple technology. Um, and almost my favorite example of that actually comes from Africa, from Burkina Faso in the 1980s, where some French and Burkina Faso scientists did a joint experiment in which they um, tried to work out how effective mosquito nets were at keeping people safe from malaria, from mosquito bites, and then tried to see what effect it would have to have insecticide on the mosquito net, and found that it
mm,
had a huge deterrent effect. And it therefore meant that you could have torn nets and they were still useful if they had insecticide on them. And that
on
the
them.
effect, the size of the effect was so huge. The the saving of mosquito bites from the experiments was so huge that it caught the attention. Eventually, it took a while, but it caught the attention, particularly of the Gates Foundation, and the insecticide-treated bed net then became the main weapon against malaria in much of Africa, and saved a ton of lives. I mean, it was basically responsible for malaria no longer going up in as a cause of mortality and coming down from the year 2003. So that's a really nice example of a low-tech innovation that changed the world. So I tracked down the scientists who'd done that experiment in Burkina Faso to find that they're Not only have they not won the Nobel Prize for Medicine, but they have been largely forgotten. And I think that's a terrible shame.
It is a shame. I will look more into it for whatever it's worth. We'll write a little bit about it.
Please do.
Um,
Let's next time they're about to award the Nobel Prize for Medicine, let's you and I write an article saying, "How about this one?"
oh, let's do that. Let's do that. I'm going to send a note so we do that because it's important. Matt, before just a bit earlier, you said something about how all the noise that was made about the vaccines not working in this particular instance for COVID-19 is also going to is eroding the trust that people have in vaccine. And so we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Um, we live in an age where information spreads very rapidly, but so does misinformation, right? So the question is, how do you think that society can maintain its trust in science, especially during crisis when misinformation can create complete confusion? How do we?
Yeah, um, I wrestle with this, and I don't have a good answer for it. I think it's a really good question, but not one with an easy answer. The method that is being adopted by a lot of the mainstream media and a lot of governments, which is to say, we, the government, know what is misinformation and what is not, and we are going to tell you and we're going to censor. That is that's what's happening more and more, and particularly you saw it in the case of COVID during the pandemic, coming from the American government through the FBI and telling Facebook what stories to ban and cancel. Um, uh, that is a huge mistake because quite often they ended up cancelling the truth. For
Right.
example, the possibility that the virus could have originated in a laboratory in Wuhan. That was decreed to be a conspiracy theory um, by the US government through Facebook. And that's very shocking to me. So, governments are themselves a big source of misinformation. And that is why I believe in the democratization of information, not through a few very patronizing mainstream media outlets, um, uh, not through government spokesmen, but through all of us having a chance to, in a bottom up way, um, come to understand what is reliable and what is not in the way of information. And I really like things like the community notes on X, on Twitter, because uh, lots of people can vote on them and can say, no, that's not a fair criticism of this chap's comment, whether it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or someone else, or it is a fair criticism of what they've said. So uncomfortable as it is for editors and government spokesmen and all these people, I think we have to get used to a world of democratized information where we fight misinformation with transparency and openness, not with censorship and direction.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Matt, in The Rational Optimist, the book, you make the case for optimism, obviously, with challenges like climate change and economic inequality. Why do you think it's still rational to be optimistic about the future?
Well, to take inequality for a start, the marvelous thing about the incredible improvement in human living standards over the last 50 years is that it has made the world a much more equal place. People don't know that. People don't understand that. They think there is more inequality happening just because more billionaires are being created. But actually, if you look at what's happened over the last 50 years, people in poor countries have got rich much faster than people in rich countries. And that inevitably means that on a global scale, inequality is declining. And people say, well, yeah, but that's no comfort to an average Chinese because inequality is increasing within China, even as it's decreasing in the world, because some people are getting very rich. Well, does it really matter if a few people get rich, if the poor get less poor? Surely that's what really counts. So I'm quite keen to knock the myth of increasing inequality on the head whenever I can. Global inequality is going down, and that's a good thing. As for climate change, I've been covering this topic for 40 years now. I first wrote about it when I was science editor of The Economist in the 1980s. And I've gradually come to the view that it's real, that it's a problem, but it's not a very major one. That I think we're getting much too overexcited about it. I think that the longer this century goes on, the more convinced I am that I'm right to be what I call a lukewarmer, that someone who thinks that climate change um, does happen, is a result of man made actions, but is not nearly as dangerous as many people say, and is far from running away, is probably slowing down because it's a logarithmic effect. It's likely to have less effect. It's happening mostly in the north in winter and at night, not in the south and in the daytime in summer. And that, to me, says that it's a manageable problem on the whole, and we ought to do a lot to adapt to it, and we ought to try and mitigate it if we can, but not at the expense of ruining both people's economies and people's ecologies. I looked into what's happening in Niger, in the Sahel region of Africa, where the government wanted to roll out butane stoves for two reasons. Firstly, so that people didn't collect firewood from the forest so much and destroy the ecosystem. And secondly, so that they didn't cook over firewood and destroy their kids' health, which is a huge indoor air pollution. It's a huge source of ill health in Africa. But the Western aid agency said, no, 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 you mustn't burn gas. That would be a disaster. That's a fossil fuel. You're not allowed a fossil fuel. And so Niger had to go on relying on firewood for far too much of its fuel. So that's just one example of where the policies on climate change are doing more harm than climate change itself.
That's right. Yeah, and for me, that's why it's very important that people approach these issues with a critical eye and really weigh out the trade-offs here that the alarmism perspectives do pose. So I'm right there with you, Matt. On the free markets, free markets often play a central role in your work. It's very clear. Can you talk about why you believe that the free markets are essential for human progress and innovation? Because I think people don't understand this.
Yeah. I think free enterprise is at the root of human improvement. It's led to economic improvements in people's livelihoods because voluntary exchange is the way in which we work for each other. As I say, it's a process of um, each of us working for other people and other people working for us, and that's what raises our living standards. It's like having millions of servants working for you, as I say, and you being one of them for other people. Um, but it's not just economically that it's led to improvements. There's a very clear pattern that it leads to moral and social improvements too. That it does cause peace, not always and not infallibly, but the argument that countries that are trading with each other tend not to go to war with each other is stronger than the argument that democracies don't go to war with each other, for example. It's a pattern that's pretty strong. Jaw is better than war, they say, but so is trade is better than war on the whole. And a lot of what went wrong in the early 20th century was countries being protectionist and therefore scaring each other into thinking the only way they could get hold of resources was by conquest rather than war. That was particularly the case for Japan, for example, that it was being shut out of markets by America and Britain in Asia. And it said, well, in that case, if you won't let us trade with you for rubber or whatever it was we want, we'll invade countries instead. So, for those reasons, um, I think free enterprise is the least worst system we've ever come up with for raising people's living standards. And as for the idea that it creates pollution or it creates inequality, less so than other systems. Nothing was more unequal than the access to healthcare in the Soviet Union. Nothing was more polluting than industry in the Soviet Union. So communist systems or other dictatorships do not produce better outcomes in terms of the environment, in terms of economics, in terms of social and moral, in terms of inequality. So I feel very strongly that we that the free enterprise, free exchange, and freedom. Freedom is a moral good in itself. The ability for me to get up one morning and work hard or not work hard, depending on whether I want to achieve something, is in some sense something of moral worth, I think.
Hmm. I love that the fact that you bring the moral aspect to it.
There's a wonderful quote from Voltaire about when he visited the London stock market when he was living in London in exile. And he was amazed because he said, here the Mohammedan and the Jew and the Christian
Mm, mm.
gather together and do deals with each other. How extraordinary is that? And
Yes,
it's a
yes,
very good point.
it really is. It really is. Now, looking forward and to the future, Matt, in your opinion, what do you think are the most promising developments that are happening right now that could shape the future of our humanity going forward?
Well, the easy answer to that is I don't know. And I think it's quite important.
I love it. I love it. I love that.
Well, I think it's quite important to say that because I collect quotes from very clever people saying very stupid things about the future. And whether it's the head of Microsoft saying in 2007 that the iPhone can find no market share in a million years, or whether it's a Nobel Prize winning economist saying by 2005 the impact of the internet on the economy will be no greater than the fax
That's
machine.
exactly what I
You know,
was thinking about. Yeah.
it's
I was going to
uh,
say share.
and I've made these mistakes myself. I when I worked for the Economist, we produced a publication every year which said the world in next year. And I would write a technology piece every year and say the really interesting technology to watch is, and then I would name something that was a complete dud, not only within the year but within the decade. So, so I have no good track record, and nor does anybody else. That's the
Mm,
whole point. The economy, the economic system, like the weather, like epidemics, is a multifactorial, um, uh, complex dynamic system, which is by definition unpredictable. It's
yeah.
small initial differences can lead to big initial changes, eventual changes, and so on. And
Uh,
so it really is. Uh, it's not that we haven't got good enough models of the future. It's that it's an impossible problem to have. Now, that said, I realize that you do want an answer to your question, and um, uh, I would, I would obviously say artificial intelligence is very promising at the moment. I would say genomics has reached the point where it's no longer disappointing, which it was for 20 years after the first sequencing of the first human genome, etc., and is going to deliver extraordinary things. Um, but one insight that I find very helpful is to notice that in the 20th century, the first half was dominated by innovations in transport. Things like the first cars, the first planes, the first helicopters, the first rockets. All of these happened between 1900 and 1950. But almost nothing changed in the world of communication in that time. You had the
mm,
telephone before 1900, you had the telephone in 1950. Expensive and not very effective, yet still. In the second half of the 20th century, you get the opposite. You get no changes in transport. You get the 747 in service for 50 years. What an extraordinary thought.
it's
You
true.
get no improvement in the speed of cars, if anything worse, congestion and so on. You don't get routine space travel, personal jetpacks, all these kind of things that we were promised in the Dan Dare comics of the 1950s.
Mm,
Um, but you get spectacular changes in communication and computing. The internet, mobile telephones, etc., social media, all these different things. So, what that tells me is that the past is not a good guide to the future when it comes to technology. And that if the last 50 years were about computing and communication, the next 50 years is going to be about something else. Now, I think it's going to be about biomedicine. I think what's happening in genomics combined with AI is going to produce extraordinary changes in how we deal with our health and our lifespan and so on. Things like Ozempic, things like cancer vaccines, things like messenger RNA vaccines are already early harbingers of that. And I think we might end up a little disappointed when it comes to computing and communication over the next 30, 40 years. Um, I don't feel the need to renew my mobile telephone anymore. You
Mm.
remember 20 years ago, you had to buy a new
No,
one every 2 years just to keep up with the
right,
technology.
right.
Now, it's not much better than the one that you could get 5 years ago.
Interesting, interesting. And so, in line with that, the fact that AI and biotechnology are rapidly, advancing fields, and obviously it's bound then probably to change our society. But there, what do you think are the risks that we should be especially mindful of when those two come
Oh,
together?
eh, yeah, and I can't get myself terribly worked up about the risk of climate change. I've
Mhm,
already told you that. I think the
mhm,
chances of really dangerous climate change are now very small. Um, I don't get very worried about artificial intelligence. I certainly don't think it's going to destroy jobs. I think if it can make us more productive and more efficient, that is going to be a good thing, not a bad thing. If it's going to become super intelligent and take over and drive you and me extinct because it doesn't like us, maybe. But we've been hearing that story, for a very long time. HAL, the malevolent computer in 2001, A Space Odyssey, after all, was on the screen 50 years ago, more than
yeah.
50 years ago. So that's,
Mm,
it was supposed to have happened 24 years ago, wasn't it?
mm,
Um,
mm, mm,
so, um, so I'm relatively relaxed about artificial intelligence and climate change, which are the two main things that most people are panicking about. I'm much more worried than everyone else about virology, and I wasn't 5 years ago, but what I've learned about what virologists have been doing in labs with viruses has alarmed me enormously. And that's where
mm,
my focus would be right now. I think that is one of the biggest threats. Things like nuclear war or an asteroid impact are always there as possible risks to humanity. Um, and there's one sort of philosophical exercise that I find moderately convincing or moderately worrying, I should say, which is that, you know, if societies are capable of becoming so hyper intelligent that they can travel all over the universe and seed civilizations elsewhere, then why haven't they shown up here? We're clearly not the youngest solar system. Oh, sorry, we're clearly not the oldest solar system in the universe. And does that imply that there's some great filter, as it's sometimes called, some technological stage beyond which civilizations never get, which is why they haven't shown up here yet?
Although
And where
Elon,
is
I mean, although
and
Elon is, I mean, I heard him today say that maybe aliens were already here among us. I think that's what I saw him say.
Did he say that
So,
today? Well done,
I mean,
Elon. Yeah,
I saw
maybe
a
he is
Twitter.
one. Maybe
I saw a
that's a
tweet.
little admission.
Actually, actually, now you and I are both going to be taken into a mental hospice for a mental hospice for saying this. Anyway, we can have fun a little bit. But who
Yeah,
knows? Like you said, who knows?
who
Um,
knows? Yeah.
but Matt,
And
this
actually, sorry, the other thing I'm more worried about is back to the beginning of our conversation: foolish policies.
oh yes.
The revival of Marxism.
Oh,
Some combination of bureaucracy and superstition, which always seems to be what brings civilizations to an end.
to an end. Absolutely. On that point, how do you think that societies going forward should try to balance the need for individual freedom along with the collective good, especially in the context of the public health and environmental policies? How do you see? Do you feel that if there's a need there, and or how do we do that?
Well, I hope we learn a very strong lesson from the pandemic. The experience of countries like Sweden showed that we did not need to have top-down, centralized um, uh, 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 quarantine and repression of the population and lockdown. That was a huge mistake. It led to much greater mortality and misery than would otherwise have been the case. So the idea that we had to clamp down on individual freedom in order to defeat a pandemic was wrong. We should have just done a lot of good advice and let people work stuff out amongst themselves. And I think we'd have had a much better outcome. And so I don't feel confident that we'll get that lesson right next time. I think there's much too much of an appetite among those in government or who want to be in government to move to a world where there is more and more control over the citizen, either to combat climate change or to combat epidemics or to produce desirable economic outcomes. I think we must err on the side of human freedom and therefore innovation much more than the opposite.
Given that science literacy can empower people, what are some of the changes that you would suggest for educational systems to better equip our future generation for the challenges that are ahead for them?
Well, for me, it's been very important to be exposed to both the philosophy behind science and the magic of what science can tell you. And I want that to be available to as many people as possible in the world. But I think it's also important to note that the way we teach science is often wrong. We teach it as if it was a catalogue of known facts that you have to learn. This is Boyle's law, this is Hooke's law, this is whatever. And it isn't that. Science is the exploration of the unknown. It's the tackling of mysteries. It's the grappling with enigmas. And so to see science as a process of engaging with the great mysteries of the universe is something that I want all children to know and to experience. And once you do that, you get over the problem that the consensus in science isn't necessarily right, but nor is it necessarily wrong. I don't want us to be so open-minded that our brains fall out and we have to consider every foolish hypothesis, like the moon is made of cheese. But nor do I want us to say...
It's not?
It's not, sadly. Oh, sorry, Maggot. I do apologize.
You just messed up my whole worldview just now. Just kidding.
Right. Yes. Well, that's me told.
So, in terms of advice, in terms of parting ways, what advice would you want to give to those who want to follow a path like yours, explore complex topics, and also challenge widely held beliefs? What's the advice for those people?
I've been incredibly lucky. I stumbled into a career that enabled me to satisfy my curiosity, or at least exercise my curiosity for best part of 60 years. I don't know. I couldn't do it now the same way because the media isn't the same as it was when I took part in it. It's a much more multifarious and much more precarious career as well. But for me, the main bit of advice for anyone starting out is keep your curiosity alive. Whether it's about the world of people or the world of things and animals, or whether it's about economic opportunities for you and your family, be open-minded, be curious, be experimental, and things will happen. Don't be afraid of trial and error. I guess that's the that brings together those themes that I've talked about in the other books as well.
Thank you so much, Matt. I mean, you always inspire. You always, you're so refreshing. Reading you, it's just you always end up with a much better outlook on the world, and you definitely exude and bring optimism. And for that, never change. I'm so grateful to you and all your knowledge, and that's why actually when I received the Julian Simon Award, and of which you also have received it before, I said, there is no way you can give me the same type of prize that you have given to people like Matt Ridley and people like that that I keep in high esteem and regard. So thank you for all of your
Nonsense,
wisdom.
Magat. It's the other way around. Unlike you, I've never actually created a business and from nothing, let alone several. And you're the
So,
person that I admire.
well, you're on top of that, you're very modest. Thank you, Matt, for sharing your deep insights with us today. Your work challenges us to think critically and reminds us of a potential for human progress. To our listeners, I want to thank you for turning into the Megatweight Show. Remember to subscribe and stay curious, as Matt told us, as we continue to explore new ideas and tackle big questions about our world. Thank you.